Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Monday, February 4th, regular meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission. We reserve the first 10 minutes at the beginning of the meeting for public comment, and the public may comment in any matter except for items scheduled for public hearing or public hearing items for which the record is already closed, which I don't think is really relevant tonight. Generally, the time limit for public comment is 3 minutes. So we've got a pretty packed agenda, and it looks like I've got quite a few people. So, actually, I only have 3. So I'll try to keep it at 3. So if you can try to organize your time. But if you have a couple thoughts after 3 minutes, we'll let you talk. So I've got Ed McMahon up first.
Yeah.
Good evening, Commissioners. Ed McMahon, Executive Director of the Home Builders Association of Lane County, 1065 River Road. As I mentioned last week, I'm optimistic about the clear and objective cleanup process. However, today, I'd like to focus on an issue I deem important to the process and I don't believe is currently in Janessa's scope of work. The C&O cleanup needs to include language that allows the Planning Commission and the Director the authorization to apply state law and including the needed housing statute. The City Attorney has made statements that forbid the Planning Commission and the Director from doing this. The hearings official has the ability to apply to the state law, but an applicant loses that benefit when the matter comes before the Planning Commission. It's an important issue that needs to be fixed. What is the point of cleaning up the code if the Planning Commission and the Director are not authorized to apply the statute directly? The cleanup should include simple, plain language authorizing the decision makers, you, to apply state law, including the needed housing statute to development applications for housing, including building permits, not just statutory permits and limited land use decisions. The City Attorney has told staff that simple building permits do not get the direct benefit of the needed housing statute. We disagree with that, and we hope that you do as well. I'd like to suggest that we send council a message to include language that will allow you and staff to do your job. I plan to watch the remainder of this meeting by my fireplace on my iPad, so have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Are you rubbing that in?
I'm sorry?
Are you rubbing that in or?
No, a little bit of both.
A little bit of both? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Okay. Next, I have Linda Hale. And if you could just state your name and your address, that'd be great.
Hello, Commissioners. My name is Linda Heil, H-E-Y-L. I live at I am with 350 Eugene. I live at 215 Foxtail Drive in Eugene, which is in Ward 2. And I am a volunteer with 350 Eugene. 350 Eugene is an all-volunteer group of climate activists, over 1,700 community supporters strong. I coordinate the Drawdown campaign, which focuses on local climate action. Betsy Hitz and I are representatives for issues at the intersection of climate and planning. The Drawdown activists have been closely following the city's climate action plan development process over the past many months. To be 100% clear, we are not working with the city in any formal capacity. We support aspects of the process that we feel are likely to have good results, and we call out and resist those that are unlikely to succeed. Last week, we presented the City Council with 15 action priorities that should be included in Eugene's climate action plan. These priorities have several measurable objectives and a list of possible action items. Please be aware that the city's CAP currently is structured without any objectives. It has 3 high-level measurable targets, but no objectives under these. I will point out action priority number 7, which is to plan for compact development. We support planning for compact development and advocate for that. The objective that is associated with this priority: by January 2030, prioritize compact development to align with Envision Eugene's plan for mixed-use neighborhoods in the downtown and along Eugene's 6 transportation corridors with multifamily housing and new commercial development. This plan should include reduction in car-centric means of transportation within the city of Eugene. We also support Eugene's transportation system plan and LTD's transit planning scenario for more frequent service. And we thank you for your work towards a sustainable future for Eugene, and we look forward to listening and learning from you and providing input from a community perspective. Thank you. We'll leave you these.
Thank you very much. You can just hand it to staff and I'll make sure they give us copies as needed. So I have the last person. If there are other people that want to speak, please fill out a green form and you can do this. Now, hopefully I'm going to pronounce this right. Nathan E. Tech? Yek? I know. There's a couple of letters. It's actually lovely writing. It's just they blend together a little bit.
Well, I've been here before.
Sorry, memory's not so
But
good.
that's all right. I know you have lots of it. I'm Nathaniel Teich,
Okay, great.
and
Sorry.
I've lived in the Fairmount neighborhood for 49 years. Currently at 2350 Spring Boulevard for the past 39. As a representative of the Fairmount Neighborhood Association, I've attended all 4 of the stakeholder meetings on the Clear and Objective Code Revision Project. And I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking to you about one particular item in your work session that will come up. I urge you to approve the several new items that require a letter from the Fire Marshal's office regarding compliance with Eugene Fire Code for fire apparatus, access roads, and water supplies. These items appear in several places throughout the document, as I'm sure staff will point you to. You should recognize that the planning staff drafted these new provisions out of a consensus of the stakeholders at those meetings. This new requirement provides clear objective standards of evaluation regarding the matter of impediments to emergency response. In contrast, 2 letters of objection to the provisions have been included in the materials submitted for your session in the record. Planner Shermer on 129 and Attorney Close on 130, apparently following an ideology of minimal or no regulation, assert that this proposed standard is an inconvenient obstacle for development applications. Such radical extremist ideology seeks to gain uncontested approval of development plans by the means of seeking to deny legitimate public opposition regarding possible dangers to Eugene citizens' safety, property, and natural environment. I refer to Shermer's letter in particular, citing a current case remanded by LUBA. She makes a crassly obvious statement that this ideology is a legitimate legal challenge to development applications as mere burdens or delays. Consequently, in this matter of fire access as well as other issues, I urge the Planning Commission to reject the demands of those who seek to foreclose the opportunity of citizens to request appropriate code provisions, as well as foreclose citizens' legal objections within the planning process. I hope you understand the issues at stake here. I don't believe that, and I hope that you see that provisions should not consider them as mere burdens and delays, and as something that citizens are simply relying on in order to gum up people's applications. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Is there, excuse me, is there anybody else that would like to speak? Okay, thank you. So we'll move to the next agenda item, which is, as you know, the work session for the clear and objective update. And we have staff here to support us. So I'm going to have Janessa has done a really good job throughout this process, as we heard from the public last time organizing. So I'm going to have her explain how we're going to go through this in an effective manner and explain. We have tonight and we have we have one other meeting scheduled. So she'll go over the details. And if you have any questions after she explains it, let's make sure we understand the procedure and then we'll dive in.
Thank you. So I'm Janessa Dragovich, project manager on the Clear and Objective update project for those at home who don't know me. And what I'd like to do tonight, I didn't prepare a PowerPoint presentation, but I do have a PDF version of the proposed draft code language that you have in your AIS packets tonight. And so what I'd like to do is kind of walk through them one by one and briefly address the ones that that we haven't received comment on and give you the chance that in case anybody wants to discuss them. If there's nobody who has any concerns to raise, then my proposal is that we go rapidly through the kind of easy ones. Some of them are really simply changing the names, the references to the needed housing, changing to clear and objective, housing/clear and objective, or the references to general/discretionary. So I'd like to kind of guide us through those and point out the ones that are more maintenance oriented. And then, of course, if anybody has a question, then we can talk about them and I can field questions and we can discuss the public testimony that's come through and any other concerns you have. If that's the case, then I'll have Commissioner Taylor run the discussion, and then I've requested that at the end of any that we discuss, that we have a clear straw poll at the end, because that was really helpful. It's helpful for me to be clear on what the feedback is, and I think council really appreciated it last time, also having an idea of where your support lied. And so I think that's kind of it, and unless there's questions about how we're going to go through, I will give you the page number reference to each of the issues, the code changes as we go through, in case you want to look at your packet, and then I'll try to keep as much of it up on the screen as well so that you can read it.
Okay, Commissioner Baker.
I just had a quick question. Would it make more sense to vote after each one rather than trying to do it that way if there is some difference of opinion on any of them, that, you know, would be easier to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, I can do that. We'll go through it. Some I might just, it will be quick. All those in favor? And we'll just have a quick, because like she said, there's a lot of them that actually are just a quick name change. So that, that's fine. Yeah. Okay?
Okay, shall we start?
Unless there's any other questions. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Okay.
Okay, so the first proposed code change is to definitions. Oh, I'll move it. There's one definition that came out of one of the issues to add a definition for the word pedestrian. And so it was pretty straightforward. The working groups, we talked about a more specific definition. We talked about the ORS, the Oregon Revised Statute definition, and that's kind of what we went with based on stakeholder feedback, was a modified version of the simple one consistent with Oregon Revised Statute. So here's the definition that we propose would be to add pedestrian as any person afoot or using any type of wheelchair.
Okay. Any questions?
And we had no public comment returned on this specific one.
Okay, all those in favor? Okay.
Okay. Oh, 6. So the next one, 2, 3, 4, 5 are on pages 2 to 3, and they're all reference changes based on the name change. So we have 9.2181. There's the bold italic language here is adding in /discretionary, and then the reference to the tentative planned unit development criteria for housing /clear and objective.
Do you want to go through each one of them, or should we do all 5 together? Why don't you just, go ahead. Did you have something to say?
I would support doing all 5 together. They're
Yeah,
all the
that's,
same.
I would like to have a level of efficiency. Yeah, Commissioner Baker.
And I would suggest that we just accept all of the
Name changes.
count 12 ones now, and we can just skip them in the packet unless there's any objection to doing that. Just seems like that would get rid of like 2/3 or 3/4.
It would be big, yeah.
So why don't we, so did anybody have any questions about the name changes before we move forward? I think that's a good idea. So if anybody had it marked that they wanted a clarification for a name change, so what are so you just named the 5, what are the others?
They're sprinkled throughout, and so if we
Is
want
everybody
to.
clear? What we can do is have a vote, and then as we're passing through,
I can-
just note, this is one of those. So if anybody wants to stop, how about that?
That
Okay.
would,
So all those in favor of that approach is that we'll just accept all of these code name changes? Okay, great.
great. Then I'm going to skip down to the revision for 9.2761 found on page 3 of the draft proposed code changes. And let me scroll to that. Okay. So this one is related to the planned unit development adjustment / modification issue. And this was one where the recommendation was to move for the clear and objective PUD process, not for the discretionary. For the clear and objective process to move to where the method of adjusting a standard would be done solely through an adjustment review versus there's now a modification based on showing compliance with the purpose statement of the planned unit development. And so that was the approved recommendation to move forward with. And this particular code language change is to allow an approved adjustment review option to lot standards, because previously the only way to modify the lot standards was through that modification process. And so it was brought up during the comments on the recommendations that this was something that there was a preference to have an adjustment review option for. And there is existing criteria under the adjustment review criteria to adjust for lot standards. So this just clarifies that you can adjust them with an approved adjustment review associated with an approved planned unit development in any zone.
Any questions? Okay, all those in favor? Do you want me to repeat unanimous? Maybe I won't. We'll just assume it's unanimous for the group that's listening and watching. If we don't say anything, it means it's fully supported. If I split it, then it means that there's different votes. How about that?
And if it's split, we'll
Saving
move to
words.
discussion.
Yeah, great, perfect.
So the next 6 code changes are all related to the name change. So I'm going to jump ahead to
Page 7, I think.
9 point.
Because that's a different name change. That one's slightly different than the other ones. Related to the name
Right.
change. I don't know.
This one is related to the name change, but it is a little different. In this one, we used to refer to some of the criteria in terms of applications proposing needed housing. So now that we're changing it to from needed housing to housing/clear and objective, and referring to this review path in general as clear and objective. We've changed the wording and replaced for applications proposing needed housing to the term applications proposing housing to be reviewed with clear and objective approval criteria. So it's also still getting at the name change issue, but it's just a different wording from the other ones.
Those in favor?
Could I make another suggestion?
Yes.
There's a number of these all the way through it. Could we vote on, if no one has any objections, could we approve all of those that are similar in just a name change because of, they said needed?
Yeah, I think we've already done that. Basically, Janessa just wanted to call attention, this is
a little
slightly different. So we'll just go, she'll go through, we're going to make the same assumption. She just wanted to highlight this one in particular.
Okay, but
Just so-
there are several that,
So she's going to skip over those.
Yeah, the next four.
So it's consistent with what we talked about. Yeah, Commissioner
Well,
Randall.
and just also to point out that all housing now is needed housing. So, we need to change that.
Right, so needed is getting struck out of
Right.
everywhere.
Right.
and that's what I was trying to get
Right.
approved that
Yeah.
wherever this comes up, we just
7-0.
take another vote and say we're all in favor of eliminating that phrase.
Okay, so the next one is 9.7007 regarding neighborhood applicant meetings. And this one is related to a change where it was brought up that there's a duplicate neighborhood applicant meeting requirement that applies, for instance, when there's a planned unit development that's done in conjunction with a land division, so a partition or a subdivision. And I've been told that these can cost quite a bit of money to coordinate, and that it got brought up and as part of phase one when we were identifying issues that when there's the planned unit development and the land division, it's really a redundant process and can also be a little misleading to neighborhoods, because at the point that they have a planned unit development proposal, their land division has to be in compliance. So if they have another neighborhood applicant meeting for their tentative subdivision, they don't really have an option to influence many changes because they're needing to comply with an approved tentative planned unit development. So this is just language that allows that allows the exception so that a second neighborhood applicant meeting is not required when there's a land division.
Any questions? Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, this is one I don't have any objection to this, but I think the wording could be improved because it should have when both the PUD and application are submitted joint together, in other words, because otherwise the wording of the last thing says, implement an approved PUD. That could happen in another application. In other words, if the thought was we would only allow the meeting to be skipped if both of the applications were submitted at the same time.
I think that we actually had talked about it in either case, because we wanted to keep the ability for people to do a planned unit development and a land division concurrently. That's one of the changes that we're going to go over. However, applicants may not want to do it at the same time, yet they're still tied for that land division to the approved PUD. And so it would only be if they could choose to come in and do a tentative planned unit development, not concurrently, and then step it out maybe for financial reasons to spread the cost, through time a bit more. And so you would still not necessarily, as long as it's based on that first approved tentative PUD, there wouldn't really be a need to do a second neighborhood applicant meeting for the land division.
Well, that's my concern in that we'd like to have the neighborhood applicant meeting show what's planned. And if you have a tentative PUD and then you come in with a modified, a subdivision plan that's slightly different.
We actually require a new neighborhood applicant meeting if there's a significant change to a plan, regardless. And so, especially in terms of a tentative subdivision or partition that's implementing an approved tentative PUD, it's required that it match.
Okay.
So we wouldn't
So the proposed subdivision has to be is required to match the final applicants? Okay.
Correct.
And I don't have any objections. I wasn't certain that that was a requirement.
Great question.
So I do have a question. You explained that really well. And if that's the intent, I guess the word that actually could be problem is approved. So if they're concurrent, one is not already approved. So does that create pause for you? Because if they're concurrent, this is basically saying accept an approved one, and you don't have it approved yet. So I think a slight clarification there would be needed. Otherwise, you just eliminate, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we could add or
Or
concurrent.
concurrent.
Yeah, so, that implement an approved or concurrent tentative planned unit development.
Yeah, exactly. Commissioner Randall.
Kind of in response to that, I was actually reading it that if you had an approved tentative PUD, that your tentative subdivision could implement that, because you get the tentative approval and then you get the final approval. And so if you've made it through the tentative approval, are you saying then that you could do a tentative subdivision if you're not running it concurrently? And that would,
I'd say a lot of folks, I mean, they'll get a tentative approval for their PUD, and then they actually submit the final PUD and the tentative subdivision concurrently. So they would be,
so that
it's
would,
kind of a concurrency and,
and that's the way I was reading
Yeah.
this,
Okay.
because the tentative subdivision would be implementing that approved tentative PUD. So I guess I don't really have a problem with that, but.
Can I ask for some clarification? Commissioner Taylor,
Yes.
were you saying that if you submitted the subdivision application and the tentative PUD concurrently, that you may not have an approved tentative PUD?
That's
even?
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think this addresses, or at least the way I just interpret, I mean, it's a great comment by Commissioner Randall. That makes sense, but you do have this other case that somebody could atypically apply for both tentative applications concurrently, and they would not, they would then, they wouldn't be able to take advantage of this.
I think that the added wording or concurrent would solve that, and I think that as we vote, I would like to vote on that change in particular. I do want to mention that one of the comments that had come in that's in your packet was just kind of a comment on whether or not 3-lot partitions should have the neighborhood applicant meeting at all. And that's just, I wanted to point out that that was something that just wasn't brought up during the original vetting of the key issues, or, soliciting key issues. And so it's kind of a little late in the process to add something that hasn't gone through the first 2 phases.
Okay. And Commissioner Fragola?
Yeah, so that was actually the question that I had, that there was some public comment on this piece, but the way that I'm reading it, that it's saying that 3-lot partitions, tentative subdivisions, tentative cluster subdivisions, and design reviews, except for, right? So that means that the 3-lot partitions are required to do a neighborhood meeting?
They are, unless they're implementing a tentative planned unit
Right.
development. We do have, occasionally, there's partitions that are done as part of a PUD process. Most of the time, it's subdivisions, but sometimes partitions.
Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I think I would be reluctant to change this because it didn't go through the serious thinking and vetting to see what the implications might be. And so I think we could put it on a to-do list for.
Future.
Yeah, it would be easier and move on with the.
So let's get a vote. And it's yes,
Sorry to
please.
jump in, but
You are always invited.
I just want to clarify for Planning Commission and let Janessa and Alyssa jump in if I'm mistaken. But I think, Commissioner Taylor, you proposed a particular wording. I might want to massage that a little bit. And so
course.
if the commission is comfortable with voting, straw polling on the idea with the understanding that the wording that you see in the next iteration may be a little bit different than what Commissioner Taylor proposed, but should still get at the idea that you've been discussing.
Perfect. Is everybody comfortable with that? I'm seeing nods. So it's basically the intent is what this particular language being proposed is leaving out the potential option that that tentative subdivision might be submitted concurrently with the planned unit development. Okay. So all those in favor? Okay, move on to the next one.
Okay. So this is, I'm going to skip this one as another naming. Oh, next, yes. Do we want, no. There was a comment on the cluster subdivisions I was just going to address, even though this is a naming one, so I don't think we need to vote on it. But I just wanted to clear up some confusion that could have come out of one of the comments was thinking that we were adding a clear and objective track for cluster subdivisions, and that's not the case. Cluster subdivisions are in themselves an alternative option that provides flexibility, and there's nowhere where we require somebody go through a cluster subdivision. So we are not required to have a clear and objective track for cluster subdivisions. This is merely changing the wording and the reference because it's pointing out that if you want a clear and objective, you have to go to the clear and objective regular subdivision process.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I had one question on, it is a COM 12 one, but it's sort of on the top of page 9, where the strikeout and it says hold for new compatibility criteria. Just if maybe you could clarify that for us so we would be more on top.
Sure. So
Are we there?
Where are we?
Yeah.
That's on the cluster subdivision. It's at the very end of the cluster subdivision one.
That's top of page 9.
Yeah, because we're just at 7. So I'm wondering,
Different cluster subdivision.
so
one's
are basically
naming.
all of them just name changes?
this is naming,
Yeah, they're
Okay.
all
that's
just naming,
naming.
except for that one, which has the same.
So this one, right, so this is another similar one where there's a couple times where we formerly had criterion 1 was to show that you were needed housing and entitled to that path. And that's based on when we were only required to have the clear and objective path for needed housing. With the change and with that now that all housing is needed housing or all housing is entitled to the clear and objective track, we no longer need that criterion that requires applicants show that they're needed housing. However, on a couple of them for conditional use permits, site reviews and plan unit developments, those are the 3 application types where we want to implement the clear and objective compatibility criterion. And so rather than just renumbering the whole section, we thought number 1 would be a good place to put compatibility. So that's why we've got the little asterisk. We're striking that requirement to show that you're needed housing, and in place we'll make the new subsection 1 be the criteria, the reference to the new compatibility criterion. And I will point out really quickly that you'll notice that the compatibility criterion was originally part of batch 1 as far as the recommendation. However, because that is a much trickier criterion to come up with, we opted to slide its draft code language to batch 2 to be released so there will be the 8 batch 2 draft code changes and the compatibility criterion when we come back with batch 2.
Okay. Commissioner Fragola, was that your
was my
question? I actually knew that was potentially, I was going to say, Janessa, yeah, prep them. Okay, Commissioner Randall.
And maybe as you go through these, if you could give us like 9.8045 as we're doing it, because I'm not turning around to
sure.
look at the screen.
about that.
And I'm just going through here, and I jumped ahead like Commissioner Baker
She'll do both.
did. So it would help me.
Sure.
So thank you.
Yeah, do you want to drive?
I'll
And-
drive.
Okay.
Anybody else who's watching?
Great, is everybody clear? So this
Yeah.
hold is really a batch 2, so just you can write in your notes, batch 2. Okay?
Which one are you?
But what you were talking about a minute ago was
We need to vote on that
9.8045.
one, I think.
I had jumped.
4-5?
So should we go ahead and do a vote on that change that we just did, the striking the needed housing criterion and holding it for the new compatibility?
Commissioner Baker has a question.
Well, no, that was, it was just a clarification. So if we're going to hold this, we're going to vote on the batch 1, but we're not going to submit them forward until we get the batch 2, is that?
The intention is to bring both batch 1 and batch 2 together when we come back to council, and that is looking like May now. We were scheduled for April, and we kind of got bumped to May. So that gives us enough time to work through both batches with you, go through public comment periods on both batches, and bring them back together, hopefully in one package.
So we all okay with striking this and having a placeholder batch 2 for hold for a new compatibility grant? All those in favor? Okay, perfect.
Okay.
That was page 9.
And the next one is also on page 9, isn't it all? And it's in all 5 applicants, which one? Yeah. Oh, the removal of the natural resource. Okay, so this one is another one that's going to recur, and this was the removal of the criterion that addresses the natural resource areas designated on the comprehensive plan diagram, which, if you recall from our discussion around the recommendation, there are only 2 sites in Eugene that are designated on the comprehensive plan diagram, and they are already protected heavily by ownership and partnerships. And so the proposal here was to remove this criterion from the 5 tracks.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I'm trying to, this is far back in the past too, but could you refresh our memory what those 2 areas were?
Do you remember the names? Yeah. They're in they're in the West Eugene wetland area.
Yeah, I mean, because I was,
And
right,
I think it's up into the west. No, I think it's closer. I think it's that one. Or the one up and to the left of that one. But they're all in that kind of southwest quadrant of Eugene.
well, the only reason I asked that is because I know when we were annexing some the property in Northeast, there were some there were some natural resources that you were planning on preserving. And then I was also thinking of like the ridgeline. So I thinking back about this, I was wondering if this provides completeness. In other words, does it capture at least a few of those areas that I'm familiar with, but there may be others that are not, have not been designated as such. So that would be there was some riparian areas in the annexation area.
Are you talking, so we did.
Natural resource.
Right, so I think one of the tools we use now are through Goal 5 and through Goal 6. So the WR, the Water Resources Conservation Overlay Zone, which is when there's a riparian area.
Right.
And there's also the WQ, the water quality, but the WR also applies over wetlands, significant wetlands and significant streams. And then WQ, the water quality overlay, we also applied during the UGB expansion to a couple of areas. They didn't quite meet the threshold to be Goal 5 protected, but we did protect them under statewide planning Goal 6 because it was important that they had good water quality.
Okay. Well,
So those would, actually, I believe both of the natural resource sites here already have the WR overlay, or it's either the WR, the WB, or the WP, one of those water overlays or wetland overlays on them. It's been a long time since we've designated any kind of comprehensive plan as natural resource. Not to say we wouldn't ever in the future, but it's certainly not a tool that we've been using.
no, that was my main concern was how did we handle these other areas?
Right.
Did they have protection? Otherwise, this was the clause that would have provided some protection for those. But if they are already protected by, special zones. It's not.
And typically now when it's for instance, in the Clear Lake expansion area for the park site, we actually designated as government and education so that a part of it could be used for recreational purposes. And then it has those overlays over the areas that are to be protected. So it kind of allows dual use.
Just to, the 2 areas are the Willow Creek Natural Area and the Bertelson Nature Park.
Okay. So all those in favor? Okay.
We don't need to go over, so we'll try to skip through the other four that are similar to that one too. So this next one is related to conditional use permits, and this one is related to the applicable standards references. So each of the tracks has a section that kind of points you to other development standards that apply. And for conditional use permits, there were a few that it got brought up could be added to make the list more complete and more consistent with some of the other review tracks as well. And this one also had, right, this one, subsection A in particular, this change was to include the overlay zones in addition to the base zones regarding lot dimensions and density requirements. Believe the others are just straight. They're similar to what is referenced in the other clear and objective tracks.
Commissioner Randall?
I just have one wording suggestion on this one that I think would make it more consistent with other areas of the code. You struck applicable standards, excuse me. I think I would also strike all, put the colon after with, and then go A through I, and at the end of I, do comma and to segue into J. I think that would be more consistent with the way I've seen other areas of the code. So it would be the proposal complies with colon A, B, C, D through I and J, all other applicable standards. I think it would read a little clearer.
I see what you're saying, yeah. So there'd be a colon after public ways, and then the word and then.
Colon after with. And then after public ways, it would be semicolon, I think. I think it would be.
Right, semicolon under the, sorry, yeah. We do have the colon after with.
Yeah.
Can I actually make a recommendation, just so Lauren can review this? Can we stick to intent? So I think the intent is that it basically is your concern that it's not clear that all of them apply. So if that's the
Well, I think it
intent.
was a little redundant.
Yeah.
Rather than not, so.
Yeah. So if we voice that concern and let them deal with punctuation rather than us design punctuation.
I think I understand the concern, and Commissioner Randall, you're not turning around, but it seems like there's been a change from the packet materials to the PDF. On that first sentence of sub 4, all has already been struck out, and I agree with your suggestion to do that. It seems like somebody already did.
I did catch a couple typos, I'm sorry.
And then in terms of the listing,
Well, when
we'll go through and make sure
typos, I'll turn around and make sure. Okay.
Sorry about that, and I didn't mark it on here. I thought I had marked
It's
a
just
couple
where
changes.
I deal with this at work a lot, and so having it easier to understand and apply always helps explain it to my clients, for one.
Okay,
Yeah.
Yes.
noted.
Okay, great. All those in favor? Okay.
Okay, so the next one is another one where there's some similar code changes regarding the timing of when public improvements are required to either be completed or bonded for, or a petition for them. This one in particular is for conditional use permits. And so the timing, previously, before the change, the timing was kind of circular where it wanted them to be done prior to the approval of the application, which you can't really have something be, especially something as costly and intensive as a public improvement, be done prior to the actual approval that requires it. And so this is trying to clean up that language and clarify that it will be done prior to issuance of a development permit, which I also want to point out, development permit is a defined thing in our land use code, and is talking about permits approved through the Oregon Structural Specialty Code or 1 and 2 Family Dwelling Code, then includes grading and site development permits. There's a list of what it includes. And that's typically what, one of the mechanisms that we do is we can do a condition and require that the condition be taken care of prior to the issuance of a development permit, because we have the ability to withhold issuance of that permit until that condition has been met. So this is changing the timing. That we changed the wording to approval will be completed prior to issuance of a development permit, and then keep the options A and B, which are for bonding or to complete a petition.
Questions? I have Commissioner Baker and then Commissioner Ramey.
Yeah, this is a legal question. Don't we usually use the word shall when something is required rather than will from legal?
It's a good question. There are different schools of thought about shall versus will. I'm comfortable with will, and sometimes I think will is actually more specific than shall.
I just know from a legal standpoint, there was a distinction. In state statutes, there is.
Historically, I think shall has been used frequently, and I think there is a transition to will. As long as it's clear what is being required, I'm comfortable with it.
Anyway, I was just going to suggest for consistency, we change it to shall, because that's usually, I see this in RS.
This one was also one that had some comment about, the words will be. And another option instead of shall or will is must, which is very clear to me that it must be. And so I was actually going to recommend that we change it to must be completed prior to issuance of the development permit or bonded or petitioned. Are you okay with that?
I am, yes.
Okay, Commissioner Ramey.
So my question was about the definition of development. I'm sorry, now.
Development permit.
Development permit, thank you. And I think there have been instances where owners have started working their land because they were outside of the definition of development permit. So I would just like to know what that definition is so we can be sure we cover those. I'm pretty sure for like example, demolition can sometimes happen without a permit.
Alyssa's going to pull it up really quick for us because I don't have the full code with me.
Eventually, just to be sure that we've nailed that, because that has been a historical, even grading or.
I believe grading and site development are included in the alphabetical list of a few different. Do you have it?
So development permit is defined in the land use code as a permit authorized or required by the Oregon Structural Specialty Code and Oregon 1 and 2 Family Dwelling Code, including but not limited to permits for new buildings, additional square footage added to a building, building demolition, foundations, change of occupancy, grading/fill, site improvements.
I think that covers it.
Okay. So there's been a suggestion by Vanessa that, or Janessa. I knew it was going to happen tonight. I blended them too at the beginning. From will be to must. So all those in favor with that change. Sorry, Janessa.
And the change.
It might happen again. It might happen again.
That's okay. I know you know who I am.
I do. And I finally like Vanessa too. So anyways.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So I'm referencing some comments that we got on this one in particular, and forgive me because I don't know these processes that well. So a public improvement that would be required would not have a development permit. So I'm guessing you know the comments I'm referencing that was saying that how can you do them ahead of time if in order to get them you have to have this issuance, so that isn't then required by a public improvement.
Right, that's kind of the circular, requirement that we're trying to avoid getting into, and we feel comfortable that this is a mechanism that's worked well in the past to not issue a development permit without the public improvements being either completed or bonded or having the petition to, it's basically assurance that it will happen.
Okay. That was my question. Thank you.
So clarifying, we're good with this change with the changed from will be to must be. Okay. Okay. So the next one, we're on the same page, the very next issue. So we're still on page 10. This is also one that comes up again under the site review criteria. This is for conditional use permits. And this one was intended to bring a standard that is in some other discretionary, or in some other clear and objective tracks. I'm sorry, and it is actually also in some of the discretionary tracks as well. And it gives us the ability to require pedestrian and bicycle circulation within the development site, as well as to nearby areas off site, provided we can make constitutional findings. So this one is kind of a complicated worded one, so I'm not sure if you want to ask questions and then I can try to address it, but the idea is to define nearby, be more specific and get away from the nearby language and use located within a quarter-mile radius of the development site. And again, the biggest benefit to this one is the ability to potentially require off-site improvements if we can justify them and do the required constitutional, to demonstrate the constitutional requirements.
Okay. I have Commissioner Edwards first.
My question is in regards to pedestrian and bicycle circulation. Are there standards around who decides, what is an adequate circulation versus, I'm just kind of curious if there is something that specifies that.
We do have pedestrian circulation requirements elsewhere in the code that get triggered for multifamily projects or some of the commercial development standards. And so we do have other things to draw from. That said, this is also, in terms of the criterion applying within the development site, it's potentially redundant. And so one possibility with this, and I'm speaking to this in large part because this is one that you got public testimony on that point, it would be an option to drop the within the development site and focus this criterion on the off-site improvements, which I think are pretty clear. The other thing to point out on this is that this one is only applicable when there's a public street required. When a public street's required, then you have public sidewalks as part of that street, which is pedestrian circulation, as well as bicycles using the public street. So again, it's potentially not as necessary outside of the ability to get maybe there's a short linkage that makes a lot of sense to something within a quarter mile.
It makes it seem more subjective than it maybe needs to be, I think.
One thing I would say is if we change this is one that it applies throughout, and it would be nice to have everything be consistent and carry that whatever change we are good with forward to all of the similar ones.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Clear and objective ones, not the discretionary.
Yeah, I have two things on this. One is usually it's the other way around, but in this case, I think there should be a clause so that we don't require this. The issue is when you have a railroad or a river, in other words, the quarter mile shouldn't be across the railroad or a river because then you can't really provide connectivity there anyway. So I don't know exactly how that would be worded, but we use that wording in some other places where we require, you can't measure a park if it's more than a quarter mile because it's across the river or the railroad track from where you are. But in this case, it's the reverse. We want to not require it when there's a railroad track or river. So I would suggest we let staff figure out how to word that to deal with that condition so we don't require it when it's impossible. And the other thing, I found the last sentence to be, provided the city make findings to demonstrate consistency with the constitutional requirements. The wording was vague to me, and I think it would be vague to an applicant. So maybe, I don't know, that's just my I don't know how other people feel.
Those are good comments, and actually, if I could clarify a couple things, the last sentence that you're kind of struggling with there is something that applies to the city, not the applicant. It's up to us to provide the findings that are demonstrated, and we know what that means, and we know what that bar is, so I'm not as troubled by that being, it's consistent with how we word it everywhere else in the code when we have to make those. The other thing that I would point out is I think it might be a little self-selecting as far as the railroad right-of-way or those major obstacles, because in those cases, it would be very difficult for us to make those constitutional findings to require something that crossed a river or a railroad track. That would be a really, really significant public improvement.
Yeah, I just wanted to eliminate that as an, someone doesn't have to put a bridge over the railroad track or something like that.
Commissioner Randall? Oh, did you have something, Lauren?
Okay.
Commissioner Randall and then Commissioner Ramey?
I guess my question really relates to the public streets. And do we have, and I think Commissioner Edwards started at this a little bit, do we have clear standards? I'm thinking specifically with bicycle circulation, as far as when you do a sharrow, when you do a bike lane, based on the type of street it is? Is it, arterials or bike lanes and local streets or sharrows or that? Because I think that could create a little bit of ambiguity in this if you're developing a project that requires a public street and you're trying to provide bicycle circulation, let's say. Obviously, pedestrian circulation, sidewalks, those are kind of givens, but with bicycle circulation, can you just say, well, it's going to be a sharrow? Or do you actually have to provide bike lanes or that, and how that gets determined? I think, to me, that seems a little unclear unless I don't understand some of the public works stuff.
It typically depends on the street classification. Local
based on-
streets, they're not going to put a bicycle lane in, but if you
Right.
live next to a different type of street, it may require a bike lane.
So if you're doing a local street and the
Then we
bicycle
assume that
circulation,
the
you just
bicycle
assume that it's going to...
circulation is going to be on the street.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Commissioner Ramey?
So I have a series of questions, and I once again apologize in coming late to this. This one I'm not quite sure I understand. I know I've been over it before, but I just want to be sure I understand it.
Sure.
Can you give me an example where this would apply to, or maybe one or two examples, off-site improvements that are bike ped connections to one of these 6 or 7 listed activities? When would that happen?
I will give an example of when this was used in a discretionary. We haven't used this one in the clear and objective to actually see anything different than what was being proposed. But there was a discretionary planned unit development where they were required to widen the street because it was a narrow street, and so to provide.
This was an existing street? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and that was to provide bicycle and pedestrian circulation.
I was going to say the widening was specifically to allow for the bicycle and pedestrian in addition to the car traffic. So it was something that came from this criterion.
Okay, so it's an existing street that's not to city
And
standard.
that was an existing street, and so, because in some of the criteria, it doesn't say if it requires a public street, so that may not be the most germane example, but it's the only one I have, so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I could imagine another situation where you might want to connect to a school or something that was adjacent to the property that wasn't connected via public street, but yet, or the greenway. Those are two more examples. Now that leads me to my next question. How many do I get?
You haven't been speaking
one
very
more?
much tonight, so you have a couple. I've been watching
Saving
you.
them up?
Yep.
Thank you. The list of activities that are here, where does that come from? For example, schools are not listed.
This is, been in the
It's just sort
code.
of the
Language
history
that's
of the
been in the
code
code,
that's
but
just carried over
yeah,
and over
But I
and
think
over
you
again.
bring up good points. You mentioned the park as well.
Yeah, school, park, greenway.
You get it to the office park and the industrial park, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I know, that's not the same
Yeah,
thing.
so, I mean,
I'm just not sure where this list came from and if it's really the list we want.
and I think one of the things we struggled with was honestly knowing like what really the intent of this particular one is, not great history on like why this and what we're really getting, what some of the other criteria don't get. I mean, we do have.
Yeah, that's what I'm
pedestrian
asking.
circulation. have another one that would require connection to parks. We have, I mean,
And then
we're looking to
my
you.
last question. Again, just a short constitutional requirements. Is that a takings issue? What is the constitutional requirement we're talking about?
Yes, it is the Nolan Dolan constitutional requirements. So to require an applicant to make offsite improvements, we need to show, I always have to think of this, a nexus. It has to be roughly proportional to the impact of the development, and you have to show a nexus between the development and the improvement that you're asking for. And so those are constitutionally required. Otherwise, it would be a taking. So if we can make those findings, it's not a taking. If we can't make those findings, then the city could still require those improvements, but we have to pay for them.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's not necessarily if you're widening a street, you're not taking the development's property, you're taking property within the,
It's not a-
hopefully the existing right-of-way.
The right way is wide enough.
It's true.
That's a taking. So that's
But
the
it's
problem.
requiring a developer to do something that is outside the scope of their development and to build to a greater extent than their impacts would require. And if we are asking them to do that, then we need to be able to make these findings that show the connection between the development, the nexus, et cetera. So that's what this language is intended to kind of flag for the city.
Right.
If we're going to do this, we need to be able to make these constitutional findings.
And theoretically, sorry, going to the fourth question here. If it's a quarter of a mile, does that mean, am I thinking this logically, the most you could be asked to improve would be a quarter of a mile? You wouldn't have to improve, so 400 yards? Roughly, I mean, in
think
that
that-
terms, it's
yeah.
like, that's,
Here's another example, actually a recent example where there was a cul-de-sac that ended, and there's two cul-de-sacs that end, and one of them has a path, and then you can connect them, and so that's another way to get a connection would be through a criteria like this.
okay, thank you.
Commissioner Baker.
I think Commissioner Ramey covered my concerns about the list, so I'll pass.
So I did have a question back on intent. Is this the intention of this? Let's say you have this proposal and these various facilities are located a quarter mile, but in many different directions. So essentially, all of them would be potentially required. So you have a lot, and now you've got a quarter mile radius, you have a school, school and parks aren't, office park, you have an industrial park over here, you have a transit stop, you have a neighborhood activity center. Was that the intention?
Would we have problems with compounding, like, requirements? I mean, I think it'd be, you're up against the issue with the constitutional findings. I mean, I think you have to be able to justify each one on its own.
And you know where I'm going with this. If we're talking about clear and objective, now all of a sudden you're justifying it. So how are you going to pick between, so can you get to clear and objective? Because this is a big paragraph with a lot of meanings. So can you get there within this paragraph and a clear and objective? You go to constitutional findings, so it's really a question for you guys. So you're demonstrating that it can be required. Then how are you guys then, in the case of my very exaggerated example, subjectively choosing? Does it open you up? So anyways, it's just a bigger question that might be irrelevant. You don't have to answer it.
I think to some extent, it's a case-by-case basis as far as whether we can make the constitutional findings. So to me, this criterion, the clear and objective aspects are defining the measurement, the quarter mile, to that, doing the list if we want to make this list more inclusive and add parks, or, if you want to suggest additions to that list or, change it in any way. I think that within the development site, circulation is more problematic from a clear and objective standpoint. I would agree, and I feel like we have other on-site pedestrian circulation requirements that are much more clear, that tell you how wide to make it and what surface it needs to be, that apply for different types of development. And so as far as the when it would get triggered, it would largely depend on whether we were able to make the findings. And we haven't had, even under the discretionary track, where we're not, locked into the clear and objective issue, we've only had a couple times where we've required off-site improvements. So I don't feel like this is something that comes up frequently because of the difficulty in making those findings. Is that anything to add to that?
I guess I would say, and again, Alyssa and Janessa can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but that initially it would be up to the applicant to show that they meet the criterion. And I would suspect that many developments do, to the extent that any of these listed activities are within a quarter mile of the development. And then if they don't, and the city wants some sort of connection that constitutes an offsite improvement, at that point the onus would be on the city to be able to make the required constitutional findings to require that offsite improvement. So.
Okay. I'm just thinking if one's cheaper than the other, it's just something to contemplate. And I have a couple projects that I'm thinking of. They're discretionary, but I'm actually putting it in the context of clear and objective. And I was like, could bring up the issue of subjectivity. So just, Commissioner Baker. Yeah, actually, did you already ask the question? Sorry, we just hadn't.
Well, I had a response, I think, that.
Okay, because Commissioner Randall.
During our discussions at the earlier with the public, the concern here was you have an off-site bicycle path, but there's no connection from the development to it. So this would maybe require a sidewalk.
Yeah.
Now, you could still have a locked gate at the development, but the point is there would be a way for someone who lives there to get to the off-site bike path without having to,
Commissioner Randall.
Really, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding that all of these provisions that are being required here would only be required if the city made findings to demonstrate consistency with constitutional requirements. Just wanted to make sure I was understanding that correctly. So.
Correct. Commissioner
I thought
Ramey.
it said, but
So I think maybe this needs to go to batch 2. Maybe we can't solve it tonight, or maybe we can, I don't know. But it almost seems to me like it needs to be turned around. So it needs to be something like if the city determines that, or if the city makes findings that it is constitutionally possible, consistent, then, and whether it's, because right now it wouldn't require a bike path to another bike path, the way this is written. So it's almost like we couldn't possibly list every circumstance. But as we're hearing, the onus is on the city to say, we think you need to add this piece, and we have determined through our findings that it's constitutionally consistent.
One thing I want to point out is that on one of the previous ones we looked at where we were adding some of the standards to the conditional use permit criteria, one of the standards we were adding was the one that gets at public ways, which that's where we can get to pedestrian and bicycle access ways. And so that one's not necessarily missed if it's not specifically called out in here. However, parks might be a good addition here, and I think if there's other suggestions to make this list more inclusive, I think now's the time to do that.
And if we're going to a list, it should be such as, or for example. Can't be.
Can't do that for clear and objective.
Do this either.
No, that's-
Then you can't do this.
So I could use some help, I think, because I'm not sure that I understand, and it may just be that I'm not doing a good job of following the discussion, exactly where the subjectivity that I hear Commissioner Taylor worried about and now Commissioner Ramey worried about comes from. And I want to understand that to be able to draft around it if possible. So could you take another crack at explaining it?
Yeah, sure. I've been kind of not wanting to bring up the subject in detail. So let me bring back this hypothetical. You have a site. It's actually surrounded by right-of-way, except for on one side. The other side has some of these other uses. You've got a park, you've got a school, you've got a greenway, you've got a bunch of things all the way around it. So let's say in let's say in your findings, constitutional requirements. So if I read it, then clear and objective, I'm going to be providing all these connections to all of these places. And there are many, right? Because they're not necessarily all going to be able to take one path. So, you know, it would be great if there would be one sidewalk and it could hit all of them. But it's not going to, because there's existing situations that are going to make it impossible. Let's put it that way. So what I'm curious to know is that's a lot of burden, right? So you find constitutional findings, and let's say that you can find them for how, I guess really the question is, what are the constitutional requirements? Are you going to be looking that all of them apply and you've got the financial obligation of all of them? Or do you then say we can actually support certain elements? Because if it's specific to the pieces, like I guess when you go to demonstrate this, what is your criterion? I'm not being as clear.
No, I think I understand what you're saying. So, and tell me if I'm misstating what you're trying to explain to me. So you've got a development site that is either wherein a public street is required or the developer is proposing a public street. So that triggers this criterion. And then you also have surrounding within a quarter mile of this development site several of the listed items, the office park, the industrial park, et cetera. And so then the applicant, I think, would say to the city, here are all these things within a quarter mile. There is already pedestrian and bicycle connectivity to these ones because we have existing streets and et cetera, et cetera. Over here, maybe you have one or two where you can't demonstrate existing connectivity. So then the city has the ability, using this criterion, to try to get the developer to establish that connectivity to those sites, the office park and the industrial park that are within a quarter mile of the development site. But before we can require that connectivity, the city would then have to make the required constitutional findings, which includes a rough proportionality finding, which
That's the critical piece.
May include cost. I mean, that's something that's taken into account. So if it would, if the city is trying to require a developer to establish connectivity to 7 different locations, and the development is relatively small, probably that requirement is not roughly proportional to the impact of the development. Okay. And so the city wouldn't be able to make those constitutional findings for all of that connectivity.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like through the constitutional requirements, you have enough criteria that's going to allow it to still remain clear and objective. That was more my question.
I think that the question is the standard clear and objective for the applicant?
I see. And then once it's forced to you, it doesn't have to be.
Right.
Okay, great. Thank you. Perfect.
My concern has to do pretty much with the list. Which really isn't a clear and objective thing at all. It's what are we doing here, and is this the best tool to get it done?
Yes, and I think that's a legitimate concern. What you said before about such as including, that sort of language is not so clear and objective because a developer wouldn't know, well, it says park, such as a park, is the greenway such as a park? I'm not sure. But if you list out parks the Willamette River Greenway, et
I
cetera.
think you list the intent.
You could do that.
Connect to activities within a quarter mile, such as, so they get the ideas, where, and activity is not the right word, but whatever it is we're trying to do, and I'm not sure I know what we're trying to do, but whatever it is that we're trying to do, then you go, for example.
I think we stay away from the such as and the for example, but you can certainly modify this list if there are other places that you would like connectivity to.
And I would just say, make it as inclusive as possible, and then we do our best. Yeah.
Okay, Commissioner Randall.
It sounds to me like, based on what I'm hearing in the discussion, if we were to add schools and parks, that would just about do it.
I'm going to add one.
You know?
I think here's one other thing to consider. Actually, office parks and industrial parks, there are no commercial centers. So really, if you're talking about housing, they'd love to go to their barber, et cetera, you know, in their commercial centers. So if you look at the list, it is a little odd it's missing some things. So maybe so it sounds like parks, schools, I'd say commercial centers. I can't think of any, without getting this list. Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I think the reason that those other areas are there is you're trying to make housing to work connections
Sure.
easier. So you
It's
probably
just-
should leave.
yeah,
maybe,
of course.
Yeah, leave those in as well.
Of course, it's just more of where most of our housing is relative to industrial parks. It's really the industrial. Okay, anybody else have any questions, comments? So are we ready? It sounds like what's being proposed is, I wish you could write on that, is there's going to be a strikeout of within the development site as well as, that's being stricken.
Right.
So we'll read, the proposal will provide pedestrian bicycle circulation to adjacent residential areas, blah, 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 blah. And it sounds like I've heard three, parks, schools, and commercial centers.
Is commercial centers.
That's probably not the right,
And again, yeah.
yeah,
can-
you, whatever
we can
the
play with it
word,
with the
make it
caveat that we
consistent
can-
with the code. Let's not make up a new word.
Okay.
Yes.
Any
One
additions?
last
Sure.
thought is this standard also in the discretionary worded this way?
Very similar, yes.
And would
It's
we then
slightly
want
different.
to modify that so it's consistent?
I think we would want to modify the other clear and objective ones so that all of the clear and objective ones
Okay,
read the
yeah.
same. The discretionary, I think we would
discretionary
wait
anyway,
until a
so,
future,
okay.
yeah, it could be brought up down the road.
Okay. All those in favor, quick. Oh. Yeah, perfect. Okay,
All good?
thank you. Okay, thanks for the patience on that one. Okay, next one.
Okay. 1 second, I want to make sure I get my notes really quick.
Okay,
Okay. And are we on the next one? Okay. So this one, again, there's a similar criterion proposed to be added to all 5 land use applications. This one is the conditional use permit one, and there is no, this one's right. This one, there was a typo. This is one where I changed it. It said proposed partition, and that was a cut and paste error. And so this one for the conditional use permit has been changed on the screen to read so that the proposed development complies with the applicable Eugene Fire Code. So this one came up in response to COS 08, which was our emergency response issue. And this one is to address, fire apparatus access and water supply availability to new developments. So this was the recommendation most supported by stakeholders. We did talk through the working groups about whether we should adopt the fire code in the land use code and have a redundant version of it adopted. We also talked about how that can be problematic as far as then when the fire code gets readopted or revised and adopted periodically, then we have to also periodically revise and update this. So this was the recommendation supported by most stakeholders, was to go with a letter from the fire marshal's office. It's consistent with two other places under clear and objective where we require either a letter or a certification. We do this for geotechnical requirements, and we also do this for the tree issues. So the requirement of the letter in itself is clear and objective. So that has been a procedure we've used already. So this is basically supported also by the fire marshal's office. We did consult with them in coming up with it before we even went to the stakeholders with it, and the fire marshal's office supported the idea. They actually liked the idea of it being required earlier on in the process for their own efficiencies and effectiveness concerns. And so this was the language we came up with to require that letter.
I will put myself in the queue, and then Commissioner Baker and Commissioner Edwards. So I just have a question, and I apologize. The last one I realized I should have asked the question slightly differently, and then I wouldn't have confused you guys. So I'm curious to know, because the letter, I'm assuming, is going to be going in at the time of application submittal, right? So do you want a fire marshal developing conditions of approval? That's my only challenge right there, is you have a fire marshal developing a condition of approval when you've got a land use application. And if you have to comply with that letter, specified in the letter, if that fire marshal didn't do a great job, now you've got a conundrum, because now you have a condition of approval that's oddly written or something. That is a concern of mine, because I think the team is important. It goes to planning, it's vetted in terms of legal issues, the wording's correct, et cetera. So that's my only concern with that. And that's more of a question for you guys.
And I think that the letter could specify how they could meet, and then the writing of the condition could fall to planning, and they may suggest it, but we weren't necessarily thinking that it would be something where we would cut and paste a condition from the fire marshal's office letter, but kind of like geotechnical experts lay out mitigation strategies, or and maybe they give a few different ways that something can be dealt with. That's what we would be looking for from the fire marshal's office, is to let us know how they could meet the criterion, or that they could get there with a condition, and then working through the condition would be more something that we would work with them to craft and ensure that it's okay. And it may be that there's a lot of them that could be very standardized. If there's, things that come up frequently and we can get that language locked down, that I think that would help too.
So is this language going to meet that? That's just more my question.
That's a good question, Commissioner Taylor. I think you bring up a good point. I think it could be read to require that the letter includes specific conditions of approval that the applicant would then need to comply with. And so we may want to, if it's the will of the commission to kind of do what Janessa just described, we might want to monkey with the language a little bit and bring something back to you that would more clearly set out the process that Janessa described.
Okay, perfect. Commissioner Baker and then Commissioner Edwards.
Well, I originally thought we were going to deal with the easy ones and then come back to the hard ones. So I was going to suggest, to move this one. But if we're moving ahead, I thought it was important that you had the word findings in there, so that the letter with the fire marshal, including findings, since that seems to be important at the LUBA level, just so it's clear and objective that way. And there was strong support for this in the meetings that we had with the public. And this was just a way of passing it off to the fire marshal to make that determination based on the current fire code, which it seemed reasonable. So,
Commissioner Edwards? Yeah, sorry.
I'll echo what Commissioner Taylor said. That's exactly the question I had, and I think that Lauren did a good job answering that. I think that the issue is that while this is clear and objective, when the somewhat subjective nature of the the requirements of the fire marshal, and because they're subject to change, and this kind of allows them to be, it allows them to apply even if those standards change over here. And so because it kind of blanket applies them, I think that your suggestion of maybe how to put some sideboards around that, I think that would be helpful, because I don't think that if you have the fire marshal, just like Commissioner Taylor had mentioned, that if they're applying some sort of somewhat subjective criteria, then it just, I think it's confusing, so.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, actually, the way that it was worded in one of the comments actually made sense, because if you look at that code, the code says that the street width needs to be so wide paved, to provide access to emergency. It's very specific, those code thing. And also it requires that certain distance between, this development and a fire hydrant. So they're not really criteria that can be interpreted. They are very specific. Those two sections on water supply or whatever, and access, they're not really interpretable by the fire marshal. Either the road is paved the right width, or there aren't any fire hydrants, then, there needs to be a fire hydrant installed or something like that, so those are, and there's some requirements about parking being prohibited adjacent to the fire hydrant, so that, it can't be parked up against, and it's not accessible by fire trucks if there were a need for it. So they're very specific.
So I want to find out if anybody has any more questions. So if we don't, yes, Commissioner Randall.
I guess my question relates, and I'm thinking this is what you and Commissioner Edwards were getting at, is the issue really the or will comply subject to the rest of that sentence there? That's really, that's where it gets discretionary, I think. And if we strike that, that seems like that helps make it more clear and objective. Or, as Lauren said, to kind of tweak the language a little to get it to say a little better what we're trying to do.
Well, so I think where staff is coming from with this proposal, I would say there are kind of two pieces to the questions that I'm hearing come up. The first is from Commissioner Taylor, who is writing these conditions of approval? We want conditions of approval that are clear, that are objective, and that are implementable. And that is something that planning staff has a lot of experience doing, and at least at this point, fire marshal staff does not. And so if this, as proposed, if this code language would require an applicant to comply with a condition of approval that was drafted by the fire marshal's office, that might get at what the fire marshal needs, but not in a way that the applicant can actually, build it, that would be a problem. And so thinking about modifying this proposed language to allow the fire marshal to still say either the development already meets the requirements, or it can meet the requirements if A, B, C, D things happen, and then maybe planning staff could actually write the specific condition that gets the applicant from here to A, B, C, D things happening. Mm-hmm. So that's one piece of the question. The second thing that I hear coming up from Commissioner Edwards, and now you a little bit, Commissioner Randall, is this process really clear and objective? And I think from staff's perspective, the requirement to provide a letter from the fire marshal is clear and objective. You either provide the letter or you don't provide the letter. The kind of what is behind the letter is a bigger question, and I know you got some comments about that. And to be honest, I would like to keep doing some research, but I have done some legal research, and I have not yet, anyway, found a decision from LUBA or the Court of Appeals that gets at this specific situation. So, again, from the city's perspective, letter, no letter, that's clear and objective. What would LUBA say about the process that needs to be gone through to get the letter? I'm honestly not sure. But this, and I can turn this over to Janessa to talk about the history. I mean, this was something that was certainly discussed with stakeholders, had some stakeholder support. I think this was sort of everyone's best effort at getting to something that is clear and objective and meets the planning and application requirements for safe development that is available for emergency response.
Yeah, and I would just add that one of the aspects of this approach was to allow, one of our bigger goals is to provide predictability and more certainty in the process. And by addressing this issue up front versus through the application process and through referrals that come later, it's identifying issues and working through them ahead of time. And then the other thing to point out is that this is giving us a criterion that we don't have now as far as dealing with emergency response at all. And so right now we can get fire referrals, referral comments, but then there are not necessarily criteria to tie into being able to get safe proposals or to get what the fire marshal would like to see in development. So
I do want to add the other side too, is that there's a part of me that likes this, for all parties, because sometimes it's hard to get a fire marshal to engage, like for a developer, developers can also be you and me, anyone trying to develop a property. The fire marshal, to get them engaged in a land use process in a definitive way can be difficult at times. So then there's some significant feedback that can come during the building permit process. So there's some benefits to this for all parties, actually. So as long as the process, which I hope the city of Eugene will actually create a system so that letters can be gotten in an effective, timely manner. And there's some work with the fire marshals to understand that because it's definitely part of the approval process and what clear and objective means, that when they have a supplemental letter, that they're kind of educated on the importance of that letter.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that, we need to work more with the fire marshal's office too, and probably have an MOU, a memorandum of understanding and how this is going to work and timelines, because that was a concern from a couple people as far as like, what if it means they could be putting it on hold for a couple months and not, and really delaying. And the intent is to not add something that would create any significant delay in the process or unreasonable delay, and the trade-off being the predictability and getting it out there early on and dealt with, I think will make up for that process being a little front-loaded.
Great. I think there's one more question, Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the comment to other commissioners that I think we should err on the side of caution when we're dealing with fire and life safety issues, and I think this is really a life safety issue. We have a situation where we're running 60% of the rainfall compared to a normal year. We were spared, for the most part, fires in the city limits last year, but the weather is not necessarily cooperating, and we saw what happened in some other areas farther south. I think it's important that we have criteria in our code that for fire and for life safety issues that is on the side of caution rather than, any other direction.
So I'm just going to add one thing to that, just so the public knows, is that really this is a building code item. So it's not like if it's not in the land use code, it isn't something that needs to be complied with. So going back to when they submit a building permit application, you have to demonstrate compliance for the building permit. So that fire code is actually.
I thought this was in the planning code.
It is, and I just wanted to clarify with you, just for the public's purposes, is that this isn't the only place that an application or a development will be actually reviewed. So,
Right, but this, anyway, I think this is a planning permit, and that's why it's important, so we don't, make decisions that somehow get propagated through the process.
Yeah, I think the fire code does apply. We don't have to adopt it in the land use code in order for the Eugene Fire Code to apply. It has its separate authority. This can be a preventative step to avoid conflicts down the road, like Commissioner Taylor was mentioning, that could be significant enough that if they've already received a land use application approval and the changes are significant enough at the time of building permit, they could be required to do a modification or a new application if they're not, in order to become consistent with their approved land use application.
That was the point I was making, is that it's not like somebody's going to get away with not doing this. It just means that you're going to have to repeat the land use application and go through a modification or potential a new application. So that's why I think this is great. But it's not like this, you pass land use and you're not going to have to apply or comply.
Well, I don't know.
And we don't have to debate it right now.
I just don't know if that's the case. You might have to provide a fire hydrant 200 feet away, so.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have to modify a land use application, though, for that, if they find that out.
Yeah.
It's more, I think, more significantly like the street requirements, that if something significant came up with that, that could kick you back into a modification or a new land use application.
Okay, perfect. So what I'm hearing is how many people support this proposal in 7, and we're going to have staff relook at will comply subject conditions of approval that are specified in the letter per Lauren and Janessa's explanation. All those in favor?
So that was a significant one that's 5 of them all at once. So we'll make that consistent for all of them.
Kill 5 birds.
Oh, 8205. Okay. So the next one is 9.8205 on page 11 of your packet. And this is for applicability of partition and tentative plan applications. Right, so this code change is one of the required changes in order to allow the concurrent review of land division, in this case a partition, and the tentative planned unit development. So there was quite a bit of extra wording and needed to make it very clear that this applies to land or to partitions or tentative plans to partition land may be submitted and reviewed concurrently with tentative PUD application following the type 3 application procedure, which is what a PUD goes through. And then if a partition application that also involves a PUD request is not submitted concurrently with the tentative PUD, the partition application may not be submitted until a tentative PUD is approved. We wanted to make sure it was clear that they needed to choose if it's going to be a concurrent review or not. And if they've opted not to do concurrent, then the former process would apply, where they need to wait until that tentative PUD is approved. And then the third subsection is just, again, addressing that if the partition tentative is not reviewed concurrently with the tentative PUD, that we won't issue any development permits prior to the approval of the tentative partition application. And then the last part is again, if the tentative partition is reviewed concurrently, again, no development permit will be issued until approval of the final PUD application. So just a very wordy way to get around what can happen when and with what else.
Any questions? Okay, all those in favor? Okay, next one.
So the next one is on page 12, and this is 9.8220, subsection 2. And this one is a change. The first part is just a easy one on the overlay zone, changing that end reference to 9.4170 so that it includes overlay zones. The second change in there is related to the partition tree preservation requirements, and this was one of the issues that we had talked about, where the clear and objective track pointed to the tree preservation standards, whereas the discretionary does not. And the recommendation that was approved was to remove it from the clear and objective track, in large part because partitions are seen as an infill tool. And so this is one where we're kind of removing a potential barrier to using the clear and objective track for partitions. And we don't see people using the clear and objective track.
Any questions? All those in favor?
Okay, so still on page 12, the very next one, 9.8220 subsection 4. And this one is related to the access management requirement. And this was a criterion that when we talked about it, it's unnecessary. The jurisdictions that have access management guidelines, they already have the authority to apply those, and so there's not really a need for us to have that criterion in our approval criteria. So it's just striking that criterion.
Any questions? All those in favor?
Okay, so the next one, we're going to go to page 14 in your packet to 9.8325 subsection 6. And this one, again, is a change that strikes a existing criterion. This one is the 19 lot rule. Some people might be familiar with it. This is a criterion that was determined by LUBA to not be clear and objective because of the term disperse. And so we've not been able to apply this criterion, and now we're removing it. And I want to add that this is one that, as part of removing it, it ties into the fire marshal letter that we talked about, because this is pointing to the emergency response criterion as a replacement.
Any questions?
Just wanted to verify that A and B stay under 6, and it's only C that's being removed.
Correct.
Good catch. Okay, all those in favor?
Okay. The next one.
It's a PUD, so it's all applicable development standards.
Oh, so, but they're on different page.
Yeah, but you can start.
Okay, so we're going to move on to 9.8325 subsection 7, also at the bottom of page 14. We're moving, this is another PUD requirement. This one, again, we have the overlay zone, and then we're adding a subsection K, similar language, and we can check the punctuation again on the other one because this is a similar insertion here, on all applicable development standards explicitly addressed in the application.
Any questions?
I just had a question on context, and I apologize. I didn't actually look this section up. But on the top of page 15, it goes to the water quality overlay zone. No new lot may be created if more than 33% of the lot as created would be occupied by either : and then I'm assuming A through J stay, K is added, and I didn't look at those for context. So that's.
This is that somewhat comprehensive list of pointing to other development standards.
Okay.
And so A through J are all different section street standards, trees, or, different things. And so, yeah, it was just in order to give you the complete paragraph where these changes were made on the overlay, but we didn't touch the water quality portion.
Is either the right word there?
Yeah, that's what.
That was really kind of,
Either,
because if you've got A through J and then adding
Well,
K.
either is actually, there's a sub under that.
Yeah.
Okay,
So A has its own like sub 1 and sub 2.
okay,
Yeah,
okay.
so I think we just.
Like I say, I apologize, I didn't
No, I
go back
know.
and look
No.
at it in
Well, and
context.
it's like, we
So
didn't want to give you the whole thing because then it's a little overwhelming, but then if we.
I appreciate
leave these
that.
out, then-
Yeah.
But there's it's either the WR or the WQ.
Okay.
which is what those are.
Okay.
So yeah, sub 1s and sub 2 stay there.
Commissioner Baker.
And the comment here was rather than trying to get the list complete, you just put in this clause.
Yeah.
Okay?
It's, yeah,
Rather than make the list, through Z.
Right, because then we'd have parking, we'd have
Oh, yeah.
family standards, we'd have bicycle parking.
Okay. All those in favor? Okay, move to the next one.
and, oh, yeah, so there's kind of three of them, the one that we just talked about, this next one, and then the following one, that are all somewhat related and kind of juggling some language around. This next one is related to the solar lot standards, so we're on subsection 10, still on page 15. Solar lot standards, we're striking out the language that says that they may be modified as set forth in subsection 11. Subsection 11 that we're going to get to next was the one that addressed modifications if you went to the purpose statement and showed, so it was a little, it was chosen to go through the adjustment review and keep it clear and objective if they meet the standard, and then an optional adjustment review could show compliance with a standard as an alternative. The modification process is a little more problematic, or the proposed non-compliance. So this one is basically removing that modification allowance. However, one of the comments that we received from during the open comment period was concern that this is an example of a standard that there's not an adjustment review process for it now. And so that is something that you can talk about, and we could easily add an adjustment review option for solar lot standards. I believe in looking at it, just in responding to that public comment that came in, there is a adjustment review criterion related to lot standards, and we just need to make sure that that same criterion can be used for the adjustment for solar lot standards as well. They are lots. It is a type of lot standard, so it may be that it's just a matter of going to the solar lot standards and adding the ability to be adjusted through an approved adjustment review if it's a clear and objective subdivision or PUD. So we need to work with the language a little bit and come back with some more on that, if that's the direction you choose, if you want to ensure that there's an adjustment review option for solar lot standards.
So,
Sorry, that was a mouthful.
is that I would like to propose that we add the option of adjustment review for the solar lot standards. Any questions, Bill? Excuse me, Commissioner Randall. Like I said, it's getting late.
It's okay.
Who knows what's going to
Not a problem. That is my name. I agree with Commissioner Taylor as far as adding the adjustment review, because I think you're going to have situations, potentially a lot of situations, where the strict interpretation of solar lot standards may not be doable. So I think being able to adjust that is an important option.
Commissioner Ramey, did you have your hand up? No. Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I agree as well, and I think it's better that it happens under the solar lot standards than here, so we would leave this clause out and add it to the lot standards where it makes more sense.
Okay. All those in favor of striking where the strike is and add adjustment review? Okay, we'll move to the next one.
Okay, and the next one is going to be the strikeout of the actual modification language. So this is the part that we're getting rid of, is that the PUD complies with all applicable development standards explicitly addressed in the application, except where the applicant has shown that a modification is consistent with the purposes as set forth in the purpose statement of the PUD. And so this is where we're removing that, but then we've got the language that an approved adjustment constitutes compliance with the standard. And then the other part of this one is, if there are specific things that anybody is aware of that that can be modified currently that would be appropriate to allow an adjustment review, like we just discussed the solar lot standards. We already earlier on talked about the lot standards themselves and allowing for an adjustment for those. So we feel like we're capturing the things that come to our mind first, but if there are other items, that's an option that we could add adjustment reviews for, we can consider that. And then the other thing I want to point out is that it's not necessary that we have a complete parity between what can be modified under a discretionary PUD and what can be adjusted. There is a point where if something is so outside the box that it requires a lot of modification, that is what the discretionary PUD process is for. And so I think that within reason, if we can build in adjustment reviews for things that are commonly modified as part of a PUD and it works to do that, then I think that we should try to be inclusive, but not necessarily get stuck on needing to think of absolutely every possibility.
Any questions, comments? So it sounds like, so this one.
Oh, and we already addressed, the other part is this is one where we're simultaneously getting rid of some language, and this would be where we would put the fire marshal letter requirement for PUDs. So, but I didn't go into that because we'll change the language consistent with what we do on the other ones on that part.
So those in favor of changing the language consistent with before, obviously, and then are you interested in an adjustment review option?
That we haven't already specified.
That we haven't already specified. So I was wondering actually if they might need some clarification what you mean and how it would fit in here.
And also, Commissioner Taylor, if I could just jump in, maybe that's a two-part question. So part one is the commission okay with the proposed language change to subsection 11 with the caveat that we will be making the changes discussed for the fire marshal language piece?
So can I actually suggest all language that looks like this, are you okay with them changing to match our prior vote? So if it happens again, let's just get over it. Okay, all those in favor?
Yeah.
Okay. Now the other part.
Second.
Just to be clear,
Yes.
I think I saw head nods around the table, but I'm understanding that the commission is also okay with the deletion of the modification language from subsection 11.
Is everyone okay with the deletion portion? Thank you.
Great.
Okay. Okay, great, perfect.
And then your second question was, are there other adjustment reviews the commission is interested in talking about? Is that?
So how about, I like the way you described it, and I think it's, since we only have 7 minutes, what I'm going to suggest is that maybe you come back and bring us with batch 2 some of these areas that you're thinking.
I guess I'm trying to turn it around a little bit because we've already kind of felt like we have done it,
Okay.
but we've had a couple design professionals kind of point out that they're concerned that it's not. We're wanting to have people actually give us specific examples of what's missing that you would like to see, and then we can discuss with you whether those make sense to add adjustment review options if they're not already adjustable. I mean, a significant amount of the development standards are adjustable already, and so it's really, calling out to people who are on the design side of things, as far as whether you can think of something that you've modified through a PUD that you think would be appropriate to have an adjustment review that's not adjustable, if there's examples.
So I'd love to table this. If you just can review your information, come back, that's your homework for batch 2, or for the next meeting, if we're going to have the next meeting. Yeah. Okay. So we'll move on to the next one. Can I actually, we are blazing through this. It's just when we've hit. Can we get through it all? If there's a difficult one, can you just delay it?
Yeah, this is the very last one that you haven't gone over yet, so.
well, brilliant.
And it's timing of public improvement, so it's actually really similar to one you already did.
Okay.
And then the remainder, I was going through them as you were having your discussion, the remainder of them, you've already talked about all of them.
Great.
So unless there's
Okay.
something that somebody has notes on that we didn't cover, I think this is the last one.
Perfect.
We want to consider whether they want to go over a few minutes to get through these last 2 and then not meet next week. And then we
Yes.
could come back with the couple, because there's only a couple that really have some modifications that we could come back when we come back with batch 2
Okay.
in March.
Okay.
So it's up to you if you want to avoid a whole new meeting next week to go over just a couple.
Okay. So let's go over this last one and then make a choice.
Okay, so 9.8360, and this is on page 15 and 16. And this is another one, okay, so it's another one related to the timing of public improvements being required. This one's regarding plan unit developments. This is shifting. Formerly, we had the requirement for public improvements under application requirements, which, as we've talked about, an application requirement is not an approval criterion, and so if they haven't done it, we can't withhold approval or get the improvements. So this is, the first one is on 9.8360 is to strike the language from the application requirements that speaks to the timing of the public improvements and the requirement. And then the next one is 9.8365, which is adding the language slightly modified into the final planned unit development approval criteria. And again, this is the final planned unit development criteria because it's a two-step process, and that's another, it's more appropriate under the final planned unit development. And it basically is the same as the other ones where it's saying, there's a little extra language clarifying because we may have PUDs that aren't done in conjunction with a land division that might have had public improvements required as part of a subdivision, let's say. And so we had to kind of address both a PUD that's reviewed concurrently and one that's a standalone. But the substance is there, tying it to the issuance of a development permit as far as when they need to be completed. I would say the same change here, we would want to change will be to must be, as we did in the earlier one.
Are there any questions? Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, there was some comments from the public regarding this one, regarding that it captures all of the requirements. There's some issue here with some kind of road project is mentioned. I don't know if that would be eliminated by this, but it also mentions the importance of having final maps and supplementary materials are required to demonstrate compliance.
That is, again, kind of like an earlier one where that wasn't something that we dealt with. And in fact, one of the out-of-scope issues early on was a recommendation to make all application requirements approval criteria or to have a criterion that said all of the application requirements have to be met. And that was determined to be out of scope in large part because the ramifications of that would be significant, and we would need a lot more time to significantly go through what that would mean in terms of denying applications because they didn't have a stamped architect saying, or, and under clear and objective, it's very rigid. And so that's kind of a can of worms.
I wasn't concerned about that. I was concerned about that if for the final application requirements that they would submit the final maps for the project. In other words.
Right, but that's an application requirement, not an approval criterion. And so what that comment was saying is that needs to be made an approval criterion. And my response to that is that that's outside of the scope because that's going back to something that we'd already determined we weren't going to, under the scope of this project, try to make all the application requirements approval criteria. The other side of that is that they're not, if they can't, it's kind of an, how do I word this? It's an evidentiary problem. If they don't submit those things, they're going to have a hard time showing that they meet the tentative requirements. And so I don't believe it's necessary because if they don't, they may not get an approval. We would have to recommend denial if we can't show that that compliance is there.
Right. It may be but couldn't it be a requirement that they must be submitted for the final approval? That's why I don't understand what the complication is.
It is a requirement as far as an application requirement. It's just not, we don't have it in the approval criteria to deny it. I feel like it's not.
Well, I'm concerned about this road project that was cited here that got through the process is an eyesore to everyone involved, apparently.
So I think what the comments are referring to is the Oakley Meadows PUD.
No, that's not that project. It's another one that's cited, I think, I have to dig it out. It might have been in one of the supplemental materials. We got an email, but there was some rogue project mentioned that got through the process, and I mean, I'd have to go back and look through all written material to find it. I'm just trying to make certain that that project, however it had happened, is eliminated as a potential problem. And if it requires that we add requirement that the final maps be submitted for, I mean, the final plan application requirements seems reasonable enough to me to add that, if that would have eliminated the problem. Again, I don't know the details of this rogue project.
So we're at time. So this, as you said, is the last one. And what I can do is I can get a straw vote right now, just in terms of getting a sense of those in favor of the language as proposed, with the strikeout in the language as proposed. Can I get a sense of yes?
Before we go, can I just address
Of course,
one more time?
of course.
I just, part of my thing is similar to the earlier one about the partitions and not needing the neighborhood applicant meeting. It may have merit. It didn't go through phase 1 and get identified as a key issue. It didn't go through the working groups during phase 2. We don't have an approved recommendation to go forward and make that change. And so maybe I didn't express why I didn't, want to act on that one as part of this well enough, but that's kind of some of my thinking, and it could be a future recommendation to look at that.
Okay, so those in favor of striking and accepting the proposed language, those in favor? Okay, thank you. So it seems like the only follow-up are some slight language changes, modifications, suggestions by staff, and then the one considering adjustments if we wanted to add additional adjustments to the tentative PUD. Was there anything else?
Well, and I would just say that the request for that one is kind of a more input to staff, and
Yep,
if that
exactly.
could come in the next couple, 1 to 2 weeks, that would be very helpful. So
You
we
want it
could
via
get
email?
Via email would be excellent, and that goes out to, I know I gave that feedback to a couple of the people who provided comments too, that if there are specific things that they can think of to let me know, and then we can bring that back to you with batch 2 and consider whether those make sense.
Okay, great. So it's 2 minutes after. Can you stay 1 minute just so that we can actually,
5 minutes, let's say 5 minutes.
well, actually, one commissioner has to leave. So I just want to make it quick that we determine, does that mean we won't be meeting next time? Or you'll send out a new agenda or a new tentative agenda?
We'll cancel next week.
Okay.
Because this was the only item on next week's meeting, so, and I don't believe we have any other items that would be ready or that need that particular meeting, so we will cancel next week's
Yeah, I'm
meeting.
going to say highly likely we'll cancel next meeting,
Okay.
Okay, great.
The specific data?
but we'll let you know.
The 12th.
And if commissioners have something to report, you can go. And if people can stay a couple minutes, please just make it quick because we are all volunteers. And so if you have something to share, keep it quick. Anything from the commission? Okay, staff?
We had a lot of stuff in the last discussion, and I sent you all an email. I'll follow up as soon as I can on the things where I don't know the answer yet, and other than that, I don't think I have anything else to update you with.
Perfect. So with that, thank you. Oh, yes, sorry, staff. Is there anything else from
One
other
quick
staff?
follow-up question.
Yes.
Just from my clarification, is the commission, so there are a few code provisions that we've said that we would modify language a little bit. Does the commission want to see that again? Would you like it to come back as along with the batch 2 code language, or are you content with the direction that you've given staff and we'll just implement it and move on?
That's a good clarification. Thank you. All those in favor of just trusting that staff understands the intent, they can make those changes. They're fairly minor. All those in favor?
I'm sorry.
Yes.
So what that means is then the next time we see it is for a public hearing process.
Yes.
Right?
So do you want to see it?
Well, it's that or try to modify it in the middle of a public hearing or after a public hearing. Those are our choices, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that's not, maybe that's okay.
Yeah.
Of course.
So it's up to you. I was just thinking of the context of what we're actually requesting of them. So, but think about it. If you need a moment, then we'll take a vote. So when would it happen? If you propose language, it would come at batch 2. Had you been wanting to bring batch 1 to city council?
We have, right now, we're scheduled with you in March for 2 separate work sessions to get through batch 2. Batch 2 is far fewer items. There's only 8, and then 9 if you count the compatibility criterion. If we add these, that'll add a few more. But we do have 2 meetings scheduled in March. So I do think we have time. If you want to see the code language again, I think that would be the best opportunity. Unless you want to just move forward, then we would take everything with the changes made in the spirit of the intent that came through tonight, and then take it to council in May.
So how many people want to see the changes before they move in front of city council?
I just think that's a more ideal scenario.
Okay.
It's not the pressure of the middle of a public hearing when you're
Yes.
debating and saying stupid things, when we can do it amongst ourselves.
Okay, great. So can I ask you, just for efficiency, so we make sure the other 2 meetings we have time, can you send them in advance? And then if you can please look at them, and we'll have, I'd like to suggest that we focus on wherever there's issues and then just blanketly approve them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, my hope would be that those will be clear, because you've given us good direction, that those won't require a lot of talking. It'll just be showing you what we came up with. And then the other thing Alyssa pointed out, we may be shifting our March meetings because of the bump in the council date. So it may be April, not May, or not March. Okay. But we'll have 2 meetings with you.
Okay. Well, thank you, staff, for a great job, and thank you, everyone, for staying a little bit later.
Yeah.
And have a great evening. It's the end of the meeting.
I think there's